great to have you join us here in person and for those joining you online. And really just like to welcome you to our roundtable today, focusing on the issue of levelling the field, looking at issues of sport and social justice and health and physical education. And we'll be handing over shortly to our panel to begin those discussions. So my name is Ruth Jeans. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. I'm also the head of the School of Curriculum, Teaching and Inclusive Education. Now, as mentioned, we've got an audience online as well today. Welcome to you all. There will be the opportunity online to ask questions as we're going along. So if you are online, you can put comments and questions in the YouTube comments section. But just a reminder that to do that, you will need to be logged into YouTube. And there's been instructions sent to you in your reminder emails and should be in the chat now as well. So I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting on today, the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. And I want to recognise elders past and present, and also like to extend that respect to any Indigenous people joining us in the room or online today. Particularly, I think, in relation to this topic and thinking of issues of social justice, and we can see sport as a potentially transformative space for really elevating First Nations peoples and their achievements, but also, again, the flip side of sport and health and physical education in the context of perpetuating racism and injustices against First Nations people as well. So hopefully in the debate today we can really begin to get into some of those issues. So as mentioned, I have the privilege of leading the School of Curriculum, Teaching and Inclusive Education within the faculty. We're a big school of around 80 academic staff and doing some fantastic critical research in those areas of pedagogy, curriculum studies and in inclusion as well, and across all sorts of disciplines and subject areas across maths, science, digital technologies, just to name a few. So this is one of a series of seminars that the school will be hosting over the next couple of weeks, and I'll come back to that at the end. So enough from me for now. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Richard Pringle, who leads our Sport, Health and Physical Education Research Group within the faculty here. And Richard's just going to set the scene a bit for the event today. Thanks, Richard.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to provide a short introduction to the topic we're exploring tonight with our roundtable. But first I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're on, the people of the Kulin Nation and Indigenous people more broadly, and hope that an effective treaty or treaties can be developed soon to right the wrongs of the past and forge a new future. Relatedly, as we are all aware, we don't work and play on a level playing field. And these problems demand attention. Yet you may ask, why, if these if broad social transformation is based on issues around sexism, racism, colonisation and inequitable economic disparities, why are we focusing on sport and health and physical education? Indeed, some of you may have felt injustices in your physics classes when you were young, and according to George Orwell, quote, serious sport has nothing to do with fair play. It is bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it is war minus the shooting. So according to George Orwell, if we want our social justice, we should just get rid of serious sport. Yet I suggest there are two good reasons why we focus on sport and health and phys ed. Firstly, regardless of whether you love it, hate it, or are indifferent to it, sport does shape Australian social fabric. In relation to that, Nelson Mandela quixotically asserted, quote, we can reach far more people through sport than we can through political or educational programs. Although I think this is a debatable claim, it's worth noting that apartheid in South Africa was torn down in part through sporting boycotts. Secondly, given the social significance of sport and its links to physical education, we should be concerned that there's been various inequalities and injustices written about within physical education as well. So on this slide, sport and health and phys ed demand critical analysis. So what is social justice? It's a highly contested term. The concept revolves around creating a fair and equitable society where everyone has equal access to opportunities and resources regardless of their background and or identity. So the goal of educating for social justice therefore begins with the question of equitable rights to education and who gets to decide what is quality education. So the concept of social justice has gained in momentum in recent years. Hitton and Betts over a decade ago noted it has become increasingly common for education scholars to claim a social justice orientation, and a growing number of teaching education programs are fundamentally oriented around a vision of social justice. Indeed, Monash University now proudly has reclaimed its history of student activism from the 60s and 70s, where at one stage one of our prime ministers had to barricade himself in the Alexander Theatre with 1,000 students protesting outside. And hence our recent marketing campaign slogan, "If you don't like it, change it." So some might say that fighting social injustice has become somewhat trendy, yet the reality is, ever since we've been writing about education, people have been using an educational context for issues of social justice and potential social transformation. And within the fields of sport and health and phys ed research over the last 50 years, scholars have been active there as well. And I like to think we've had some success in shaping our current curriculum, contributing to the growth of women's sport, and also increased awareness of the harms of things such as homophobia. So how does one teach health and phys ed for social justice? Rod Philpott and colleagues recently asserted that the broad principles that underpin social justice are closely related to the teaching strategies employed within critical pedagogies. These related teaching strategies include 1. Shared power and decision-making between teachers and students. 2. Approaches that value diversity. 3. Strategies that recognise the importance of cultural and individual differences. And 4. Strategies to build trusting relationships and supportive learning environments. At this point, however, we are unsure about the effectiveness of these teaching strategies for promoting social justice. Richard Tinning recently concluded, notwithstanding some individual successes, the impact of our work in the critical project has been marginal at best. Accordingly, not only should we be modest in our claims for what critical pedagogy might achieve, we should also be modest in what we claim it has achieved. Doug Booth similarly states that it is primarily the scholar activists who have had a more direct influence in shaping policy and the public consciousness, thus echoing Frederick Engels' maxim that an ounce of action is worth a ton of theory. Yet our social world is a different place from 50 years ago and even 20 years ago, so social change does take place. In this light, I do believe that the influence of critical scholarship might be modest, but teachers and academics can all play a part in challenging understandings, raising awareness, and co-producing a joint future. And this challenge lays at the heart of this roundtable discussion tonight as we explore the role of sport and HPE in levelling the field through fostering social change. So at this point, I hand it over to Professor Dawn Penny from Edith Cowan University, who is the Vice-Chancellor's professorial informer at Edith Cowan. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard and Ruth, and welcome everyone again to this event this evening. As Richard mentioned, my name is Dawn Penny. I'm privileged to live and work on Wajak Noongar Budja, so I'm a long way from home today, but amongst long-standing colleagues who I've worked directly here with at Monash and over the years at different institutions. So I recognise the wealth of experience that they have to offer to these issues, and it aligns really well with my own work that's been involved for many years trying to challenge those issues of how do we advance quality and equity in health and physical education and sport. So Richard's invited us to start with, the question really of how can health and physical education and sport contribute to more socially just societies, and we hope that this evening will go some ways towards answering that question. So I'm going to pose some questions of the panel members that we have and invite them to share their perspectives on what are really a number of sort of key issues and challenges in contemporary society that sport and health and physical education is being called on to address by ourselves and by others. So let's get started and meet the panel. So you've met a couple of them already. So perhaps turn first to, on my left here, Associate Professor Laura Alfrey. If you can tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Yeah, my name is Laura Alfrey. I'm an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education here at Monash University. I'm very grateful to live and work on the lands of the Bunurong and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. And tonight I'll mainly be drawing on work I've been doing over the past few years with local partner schools, with the view to advancing equity, and doing that mainly through co-creation of curriculum and pedagogy in school contexts. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Karen Lambert.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming and tuning in online. My name's Karen Lambert. I'm a senior lecturer in the school, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about one of the projects that I've been working on with regards to gender-based violence in community sport and the role that raising awareness in that site can have impact on social justice and on equity. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm also love living and working on Bunurong country down here at Frankston.
Thank you. Dr. Lisa Hunter.
The name given to me is Lisa Hunter. It's all one word in lowercase. Pronouns they and it. And some of these things have been in my history of teaching since very early 80s. That has included both in primary, secondary, as well as middle when it came around, and now tertiary, in trying to understand how equity is something that works through our daily practices, as well as part of our curriculum of health and physical education. So I was around when the national curriculum was being developed, well before it became this thing called national curriculum. And it was also something that was very much at the heart of thinking about health and physical education as a space for equity, because we acknowledged that PE was seriously lacking in its equity, and that included towards this idea of health. So even today we still see this word PE around the place as a separation. Other people had visions that were far beyond that. We'll get to that.
Thank you. Excellent. So having had those introductions, we'll make a start with our first theme for discussion, which is empowerment, power, agency in health and physical education and sport. So Lisa Hunter, just following on from your introduction, your work very much suggests that empowerment through health and physical education and sport has great potential and needs to be actively pursued. And alongside that, Laura, your research on youth voice, you highlight that important role that empowerment has to play in advancing equity. So question for both of you really is how that relationship between empowerment and agency has been fostered in the context that you've focused on.
I think in the context where it's been successful is where the people with the power realise that they can't do it on their own, and that there's a lot to understand in terms of power dynamics to ensure that the people who are being served are actually involved in part of the answer, not just part of the problem. So in terms of empowering people to be able to make decisions, or to be able to be involved in designing their own life story, I guess, it is about power sharing, but also an ability to be able to see how power is operating. And for example, when we talked about the national curriculum being developed, who gets invited to the table in the first place under how we shape and frame health and physical education. Some very good projects were ones that brought teachers to the table, so it was very much a grassroots initiative that designed what then became national curriculum, because it was the work that teachers were doing in their classrooms that informed the final shaping of it.
Fondly
know
remember
well about
times in Queensland many
Yes, that's right. And
years ago.
Victoria, yeah.
Yes. Laura, make a comment on.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. In the context that I work, health and physical education, I'm seeing the interplay between agency and empowerment, and they're obviously very closely interrelated, with one influencing the other. It's already been mentioned a few times, health and physical education has a complicated history and arguably present. But for that reason, I think it's also an ideal place for empowerment, for opportunities to enhance agency and voice. We've seen in our local partner schools, research there has seen that if young people are provided systematic and ongoing and meaningful opportunities to amplify their voice and their agency, that it can have positive impacts for their sense of agency, their comfort levels in health and PE, which again is not necessarily a given. And we can also begin to see examples of empowerment, or at least empowering, within and beyond health and PE in some contexts.
So I guess just picking up on some of those things that you both said, can you think of any sort of specific strategies, be it power sharing or be it, directly trying to give voice to certain people you're working with? How have you found we can be effective in actually mobilising that empowerment?
Should I go? Yeah, sure. I think firstly it's really important that whatever strategies we're talking about are embedded within an empowering system, be that a school or a sports club or an organisation. By that I mean the policies and the culture and the practices and the people are empowering, and intentionally so. On that, I think we need to think about who we're asking to enact these strategies, or who might be developing these strategies, because the reality is that we're in a bit of a brave new world, and the chances are that the teachers and coaches we're asking to enact some of these strategies did not have empowerment or indeed student voice and agency as part of their teacher or coach education. To get to your question, Dawn, the nitty-gritty, I guess. You mentioned power sharing, and that was one of my strategies that I would encourage, such as collective decision making, and also mechanisms for systematic listening and responding. So many of the young people I've worked with over the past few years get asked their opinion a lot, but they see little change or action that flow on from that. So other than power sharing, I'd say that a key strategy is to intentionally and systematically listen and respond. And if action cannot flow on from young people or marginalised groups' suggestions and ideas, that there's a very clear explanation as to why action has not followed. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and some of those strategies are ones that we have in teacher education, and I certainly know with the middle schooling movement, there were ideas and practices like democratic classrooms, negotiated curriculum, and it's through those structures that are practices that are set out for teachers to follow. Pedagogically, they're enabling kids to understand even what they want to say, and it's not just being about what I want, but it's understanding it in the complex relationship of students in a class. So one of the studies that I did had a very long-term and intimate look at a group, one class group and its teachers, and how they interacted and how we align with the teacher or not with the teacher, and the work that gets done by the kids in the class as well as the teacher for that alignment as to even how to frame what HPE is and what's valued, for instance. So very much it was around performance and appearance, surprise, surprise, But it wasn't just by what the teacher set up, it was also how some of the kids aligned with the teacher to make that an important value that got carried through the sorts of testing that you do. And some of the work we did with Peter Hay was having a look at how we frame assessment. We are telling the kids what's being valued. No brainer, but for people to learn to see that sort of thing and then also know the pedagogies to enable power sharing, that's a lot harder. And some of the teachers who were trying to do that work, these are very deep practices that we have that need undoing, and the unlearning to relearn, a little bit like racism and sexism, etc. Being able to see it in the first place to make that space, but then also to scaffold decision making and revaluing what we count as something that's worthwhile spending time on in the classroom, class space, and as endorsed by assessment.
Great, thanks. Karen, perhaps if I can flick to you and your focus of your work on preventing violence in and through sport, and how empowerment of individuals and communities can translate into that broader societal change around those issues that we're seeking.
Thanks, Dawn, and thanks for the groundwork there. I think what's really important for me to say from the outset is that individual and community empowerment is already linked to sport, right? But I'm going to throw a spanner in here and go, it's actually a really one-way process. And where those who are most disenfranchised are actually expected to be the ones who change the system. They're the ones that rattle the board or to put in changes that need to happen in spaces or clubs. I don't think that's equity or social justice. In fact, I think it's still a form of oppression. And what I notice and what I see a lot from the sorts of research that we've been doing in community sport is that it's really easy to take on and win by basic things, a policy that gets put into place, a woman who suddenly becomes on the board, but that the people who are the oppressors and in power actually continue to benefit from those things at the expense of the disenfranchised in some kind of way. So I think some examples here might be where you might have a win-win, really basic things, and this is one of the frustrating kind of parts about changing sport is people get excited in clubs about putting a baby change table in a men's bathroom, or putting the lights on for a women's sports team or a women's team playing on the night. Again, not true equity, not even attempts at equality. So I think what's kind of needed and how I see the broader link to society is that these approaches are tokenistic, and social justice approaches and empowerment approaches tend to be that way. So I think dismantling the power structures is what's required, both inside and outside sport, when we because the holders of those places will continue to hold them while there's not some serious disruptions that are kind of made. That's my take on that.
Yeah, very much agree that, to get beyond that tokenism, we have to look at dismantling those structures, and as you've highlighted, Lisa, it brings us to values that are embodied and institutionalised as well. And I wondered, anyone around the table really, have you got examples from your work where we can identify and describe where that sort of bigger dismantling has occurred? Or if not, what you see as the biggest challenge to us making that step?
I can go if you want. Have the
Thanks.
mic. I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying very modest project, again with the local partner school. But over the last few years, working in particular with Westernport Secondary College, I asked their permission to name them and they said that was fine. But they've been working really hard, probably for the last 4 or 5 years at least, to dismantle and challenge, or we'll say at least challenge, traditional power structures in health and PE. So led by Ali Dowler, this is ongoing work for her. One of their biggest successes in recent years has been a student-led redesign of curriculum and pedagogy related to fitness testing within health and PE, which historically is a problematic practice for many. So now what we're beginning to see is new and more dynamic power structures in one school on the Mornington Peninsula, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been accompanied by some challenges, but also some benefits that I think it's important to acknowledge, such as greater engagement, motivation, and a greater sense of agency for some of the students.
Great. Did you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dawn. I guess building on Laura's example, mine's also at that very local level. And I think through a lot of the research work I do in the sporting space, it is really at the local level that those profound examples of dismantling particular structures are occurring. So particularly in the work I've done in looking at gender equity within sport and creating and addressing inequities, it has been clubs that really have sort of moved to what Lisa Hunter's just talked about in terms of that unlearning. They've kind of looked at their systems and structures and gone, we can't just tinker around the edges here. We can't just put a baby change table in to really create a dismantling of these inequitable structures for gender. We have to look across the board, literally the board, the governance of the club, and all the sort of processes downwards. And so those have been sort of the clubs that I've seen the most profound transformation in, where either some of them have built things up from scratch, so they're not actually dismantling anything. They've started from a different starting point. They're not coming from this historical position of oppression. They are creating the structures from scratch. But others have gone and they've looked at the composition of their governance, of their boards, of their committees. They've looked at why particular groups aren't represented and what they might need to change in how they run and organise those groups to encourage different people to be in power within their clubs. They've looked at things like their policies, how they're addressing discrimination, but what also they can do in relation to proactive policies around, say, who gets allocated to different spaces, who gets certain time slots, who's able to use particular facilities that are available. And then also done education work with their coaches, who are the interface between the players, be that young people or adults, and really sort of work with them on particular social justice principles that have then made changes into how sort of the teams operate and what's tolerated within that setting as well. So I think it really has been similar to your example, Laura. It's that local level that we've seen those profound sort of dismantling of existing structures that I think sets the path for empowerment.
Great, thanks, Dawn. Thank you. And that sort of takes us nicely, I guess. I want to sort of stay with some of your work, Ruth, as well as others, in turning to gender equity and justice in sport and health and physical education. So Ruth, in your work examining gender equity, you've very much highlighted, as you just explained, that need for people in many roles to work towards breaking down structures and damaging gender norms. And Karen, your work's focused on, and is at the moment focusing on that violence prevention in the sporting context. So how do you both see that intersection between gender equity and violence prevention playing out in the, sporting landscape here in Australia or internationally?
Yeah, thanks. I had a whole list of things, but I realise we have a limited window to speak to. So I'm going to stick on and stay with some of the big ones, some of the big players here, because what we're talking about is how back to what I just said before, is how sport mirrors and reflects a society. And I think there's two big things here that we can think about that are working in tandem. And so how I'm going to frame this kind of response is as a solution and a problem, but I'm going to start with the solution. Yay, for a change. Sport reflects broader societal values and broader societal practices, and gender inequities and other inequities are embedded into that. So in the case of gender-based violence, for example, in sporting clubs and in society, it's overlooked and it's normalised. Violence is normalised as a particular practice, and most definitely through sport we actually see it as such. And so there's power operating in there amongst people already, inside and outside. So I see how that's linked. So instead of just thinking about this as a problem, that's actually what's going on. So how do we deal with these systemic power structures that actually continue to operate, which is based on the previous question? I think you're going to get lots of answers around that. So bear with us. But I'm going to give you two examples that I've learnt from this project with Sport and Rec Victoria. Is that what's needed is men need to step up. Men need to step up and actively engage and advocate, and it's actually not the men who are already stepping up, because they're already stepping up. It's not the men who poo-poo and are misogynistic and sexist and will never step up. It's the really big bell-shaped curve that's in the middle there that need to step up. They go, oh yeah, that's a nice idea, but nah, it's not my kind of thing. So it's like the fluctuating voters, in some kind of way. And I think another thing that's linked to that, in certainly in the club-based settings, is quality education by experts. So it's people who know what they're talking about coming in, rather than someone who's a cheap provider, for example, a local friend who we happen to know who does a mental health program or something like that. And it's what we've found in this project is that it's actually women's health organisations who are the experts in the field. It relates to a point I'll say later about partnerships. And I think the second thing, and then I'll hand over to Ruth, is that sport is really kind of mononormative in some kind of way. It's binaries, deals with binaries, winning and losing, and men and women and race and black and white. So it's really quite obvious. So the intersectional experiences of people in this particular example that we're speaking about, gender-based violence, it's of people who are gender diverse and or identify as women, and they don't have access to resources and assets that might be available to people who don't experience those things, sorts of things. So people are entering with particular kind of experiences and behaviours, and sport needs to respond to those. So a really easy, straightforward example is the need for very clear disclosure policies and procedures for clubs and training around that from, again, these women's organisations. So, and listening to the people who are actually your clients, or who are having experiences or not having experiences in particular ways.
Thanks, Karen. And I'll sort of bounce off that and think about community sport also is, I think, a real site where, as you mentioned, education can happen, and where we know there's gender inequities within community sport settings, and we also know gender inequities are a contributor to violence against women and gender diverse people. So I think the intersection of doing gender equity work to address violence against women, it's a crucial space. And I think what we've sort of seen through the project as well is addressing gender inequities is that first step on the journey. And just really going back to Richard's point earlier about critical pedagogy, seeing that engagement and education of inequities, it's a critical consciousness raising exercise. It raises awareness of those inequities and how women and gender diverse people are being disrespected within club environments, and what the implications are for that. So I think it's a really powerful space to raise to the surface those inequities, make them very obvious, to then really promote sort of thinking around, well, how can we change this? And I think when we begin to shift towards more gender equitable environments within sport, we can then begin to really do serious work in relation to addressing violence and wider violence that exists. But it needs that work. What we've found through our research is that work needs to happen first to really then be able to make sport a powerful tool in the addressing of violence against women and girls and gender diverse people.
And I guess that need for that work is something that I'm sure, people here and the audience online, a lot of people will recognise, well, we've been talking about this for a long time, that need, and I want to turn back to you, Lisa Hunter, and sort of, you know, the period of research that you've been maintaining that agenda for as well, and ask, well, have you seen those dynamics changing, and if so, in what way, and what's the urgent need now in terms of making health and phys ed and sport that more gender equitable space?
Thanks, Dawn. Yes and no, and it depends. So, yeah, if you know Sheila Scratton's work, then you know a little bit about history and gender in health and physical education in Australia. If you don't know her name, look it up. Because I think we are seeing various cycles just repeating themselves, because, of course, as soon as people become more educated about something, they can use that in powerful ways to challenge the system or reignite the system of the problem. So whilst we then had other people like Jan Wright and Heather Sykes, for instance, who have done wonderful work in gender, first of all to do with the gender binary and essentialism, but then also beyond the binary, they've allowed us a language to see some of what's going on. So sometimes learning to see the problem in the first place is part of the answer with that language. So what I have seen changed is not necessarily gender equality, but I have seen a more sophisticated language to see the complexity of some of the problems, and also how, for instance, women in a binary system are also part of keeping that system in place, if we're talking about patriarchy, for example. So I know my Year 11 sociology of sport class in 1986 understood some of this stuff, and yet we're still working really hard in our professional organisation as a peak body for HPE to see how gender equity, gender parity, gender equality can play out through HPE rather than it being disengaged through comments like, oh, that feminist stuff. So I think at the same time that we have made some big inroads, we've also had some big backlash to work with. So we go another cycle.
Great, thanks very much. So perhaps, you know, again, just opening up, challenges of intersectionality, particularly considering, you know, be it race, sexuality, gender identity, those dynamics. Any comments from anyone else on how sport and health and physical education can move beyond these binaries and norms to create those more inclusive environments?
I'll jump in real quick there, because there's a lot happening in the sports space around the term or the concept, and in the health space around intersectionality, what it actually means and how it can be kind of mobilised and operationalised. So I definitely think that there's a need for deeper understandings around what the term is and does, and that we can learn from other sites, for example, from health, about what that can look like, but that there's this ongoing challenge with regards to the operationalisation of intersectionality in genuine ways, not tokenistic ways. So I think a greater research that looks at and defines, really gives really clear instructions around what that is, what that can look like, is actually needed in the space. But I also think leadership is needed in the space. So I think lead organisations in Australia and nationally actually have to step up in terms of their frameworks, their policy guidelines, and provides support that maybe isn't named as intersectionality, but that just does it, that provides frameworks that actually clubs on the ground will end up engaging with. So it's a policy frameworks, guidance, and greater understanding and research.
Great, and it's a nice segue then, Richard, if I can bring you in at this point, and your research on trans athletes being, particularly relevant here, and how that ongoing debate about trans athletes, reflects those broader societal struggles, with gender norms and binaries, and what role HPE and sport can play in moving us beyond those and resolving some of those tensions?
Thanks, Dawn. It's a big question. The research that I was involved with was when World Rugby put a ban on trans females playing rugby, and they used the disingenuous idea that trans players were going to hurt other players, and they possibly hadn't looked at the game of rugby closely. With regards to the concussion rates and injury rates with tackles and various things, and they hadn't talked to a lot of female players about what they thought. So that was the context for the research. But in terms of what's been happening in the last 20 years, there's been a growth in diverse genders and sexualities as recognised, and a growth in use of different pronouns, terms like cisgender, gender fluid, trans, queer, LGBTIQ+. So we can sort of think that we're looking more accepting of these diversities, but at the same time there's been tremendous backlash. And Raewyn Connell has talked about the backlash from the Catholic Church, from authoritarian governments. Pope Francis came out and said the ideology of gender is the most dangerous colonisation of ideology because it aims to mask differences between males and females. The Hungarian dictator has banned sexuality studies at universities. DeSantis in Florida has reduced sexuality education in schools. And 20 states in the US have banned trans athletes at schools. So there's been this tremendous sort of backlash. And fundamentally, playing the trans card as a politician is not related to the real issues within sport. It's about signalling that I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian, I'm orientated towards traditional family values. So it's been used as a political weapon. And it's missing the bigger picture because with trans people, the rates of suicide and self-harm are 4 times greater than cisgendered straight people. So what can we do differently in health and phys ed and sport to challenge that? It's a huge question, but I guess sticking with good sexualities education, respectful relationships, challenging the use of homophobic language, the use of allies in schools and sports, and I guess highlighting through our research the political nature of this debate as well, and thinking about where our real care should be.
Great. And I mean the depth to which those issues run, and I'll, like you say, politicise that, and it links that you've described in your work. This is, the wicked problem, and that's what I want to sort of turn to next, really, as to, why that inclusion of trans athletes in sport remains, from your perspective, so difficult to resolve, and how indeed, your own or others' research can get us beyond that and inform future discussions and policies towards more equitable futures.
Yeah, it's the term wicked problem was first used in 1973, and it was with regards to problems that never get solved. They sort of get resolved, and also problems that use the understandings to know the problem to also solve the problem, and they're also politically linked. With regards to the issue of trans or sex testing at the Olympics, there's been attempts since the 40s to solve this. And it's interesting if you look really quickly at the history. In the 40s, it was female athletes had to parade nude in front of gynecologists. They deemed that wasn't significant for deeming whether you were female or not. In the 60s, it was colloquially known as a grope test to see if you had internal testes. That was deemed not significant as well. In the late 60s, it became a chromatin test to test whether you had XX or XY. That was deemed to be a good test of chromatins, but not of whether you had a female body or not. Then they gave up for a period in the 70s with sex testing, although they had people watching you pee into jars, which sort of worked by default with drug testing. In the 90s, they said it's actually testosterone that determines whether you're male or female. and they initially said it was 10 nanomillilitres a litre, and then it was 5, then it was 2.5. And I think the history of sex testing in the Olympics shows that it's a sort of a gender's a socio-medical construction. They haven't been able to define it, which is interesting. So it's sort of with irony. Given it's a wicked problem, I don't think my research or other researchers are necessarily going to solve it with any certainty. But we can point to the complexities, we can point to the politics, and we can also sort of urge caution with how decisions are made about who can play. The overwhelming majority of trans athletes don't want to be world champions, don't want to participate at the Olympics. They simply want to be recognised for their sex, and if they can play in a team that matches with their sex, then they feel good about that. And most of the players that I've talked to in rugby are quite accepting of that as well.
Great, thanks. And that's sort of nice to perhaps come back to you, Ruth, and listening to Richard talk, what, parallels you see to sort of work and your ongoing work, focusing on the struggles of women, of people with disability, of people from cold communities, them trying to achieve equity in sport on their terms, and perhaps your reflections on some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. And obviously, Richard's highlighted a whole complexity of sort of systems of oppression that exist for trans athletes there. And I think that's key in thinking about how we might take lessons to look at other communities, identities that are marginalised within sporting contexts. It is really thinking about what privileges exist in what settings, how are those privileges operating, who's benefiting from those privileges, why do they exist, and who is being marginalised because of that. So I think in terms of looking at a more sort of, I guess, inclusive response, it is really about responding to those wider systems of oppression, and in doing so and in challenging some of those and in pushing back against some of those, there's going to be benefits for multiple groups that are currently discriminated against or marginalised within those sporting contexts. I do think, though, as well, whilst just from sort of working at that kind of local level and within different clubs, having a particular focus on one particular inequity, be it gender inequity, can sort of unlock thinking about how other groups might come into that club. Also, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it remains a blind spot. So in specifically the work I've been doing in gender equity, finding women with disabilities engaging in sporting contexts has been really difficult to do because they're just not there. So a club may be really sort of proactive and thinking about addressing gender inequities, but they're not necessarily thinking about how particular gender inequities intersect for women with disabilities and what additional things might need to be considered there. Similarly for women of colour, First Nations women as well, that requires additional thinking, again, going back to those systems of oppression, thinking of what are those different systems that might be impacting women in different ways. And that, I think, from sort of the research we've been doing is not necessarily happening at the moment. So I think there is, when you look at opening up the space for a particular group, there's always lessons that can be learned of how that can translate over to opening up to other groups. But there has to be that awareness and a removal, I guess, of the blind spots that you just may not see or may not be aware of in relation to those different intersections.
Great, thanks. And I guess, that need for that awareness and what you talk of as that additional thinking, in a way it brings us back to this need for, other voices to be at the fore of the table, and wondered, again, opening it up really for how we can get those voices of currently marginalised groups, be they First Nations, be they people with disabilities, trans people from cold communities, whoever we're sort of talking about, how those can be better amplified in policy and decision making in health and phys ed or sport? So, Karen.
I'll have a crack at that one, Dawn. It's kind of, I'm not going to talk about how to amplify those voices. I'm going to talk about what the holders of the power can and should do, and that is decentering themselves. So by decentering privilege, whether that's whiteness, whether that's able-bodiedness, maleness, whatever that is, actually. But it's starting from a position where those things need to be dissented. I'm not on a board. I'm not on a board because I want to perpetuate my whiteness and my able-bodiedness. I actually want to step out of that space. So there's some form of potentially that as a lens, as a starting point for policy, which involves then actually talking to people and finding out what their experiences are, and especially the ones where it rubs against my own, and I will own this, experiences. So I think anti-racism, decolonisation of sporting contexts can actually be aided by that. And I think forms of really active, let me use the word authentic, allyship, in not tokenistic kind of approaches that would really work there.
Great. Do you want to add?
I'll go out on a limb here and say I'd like to get rid of sport out of HPE. We take a lot of things for granted. The sand shoe on the slide there, it's perhaps justified using health, but it's not a symbol of health. And even looking at the partners we have at the moment and what gets done through HPE, I think we've really got to have some more clear discussions around the place of sport and what sport brings in. I'm by no means an anti-sporter. I love sport and got a lot of damage to show for being involved in a lot of sport. And it has its good sides, but I don't think advocating for sport needs to take up so much room in our professional association. And I think that there are 11 other areas in HPE national curriculum that need considerably more attention because they are the solutions. We don't actually need to know any more, we just need to do it. And so I think that, I'm sure this will kill me probably saying get rid of sport, but I just think that we don't need to keep reinventing this wheel and then a few little pockets of people try to do something and they make important partnerships between schools and organisations and some great stuff happens and they don't get the support, so it stays small and people retire and get burnout, etc. So, yeah, I won't be here in 20 years' time to talk about why we still haven't taken sport out of HPE, but maybe that won't be being talked about.
And I think, and we might get to it later of what we're talking about by sport, and is broadening the notion of sport actually key and fundamental and a way forward with that. But look, did you want to... You've got the mic, Laura.
Well, I can always say something.
Absolutely.
It might not be valuable. I will keep it brief, but I think in answer to your question around policy and decision making, and these are not my words, but not about me without me. If you are in a position where you're developing or refining policy or making key decisions that will impact anyone, but marginalised groups in particular, especially to those that you don't belong, invite them into the conversation. And linking to Karen's initial point, they need to be rewarded for that work, and it shouldn't be hidden labour or volunteerism. I'm talking money.
Great.
Cold hard cash.
Thank you. And I think, so far, several people, it's become obvious, I think we're all agreed, it's collective action that is key here, and that demands that we sort of turn to partnerships and collaborations to drive social change. So, Karen, you've emphasised the importance of partnerships in your violence prevention work, and Laura, as you've just mentioned, you focus on that collaboration with young people in the health and phys ed space. Can you share a bit about how partnerships and collaboration between different stakeholders, has contributed to progress in terms of that social justice work?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to look at the first level, the funder. So the funding organisation in the project that I've been leading, one of their key outcomes and objectives was focused around providing funding to those folks who would have partnerships. So there was a partnership requirement. So a lead organisation had to work with another organisation. If the lead was in sport, it had to be, the health organisation. If it was a health organisation lead, it had to be a sport lead and other people that were involved in that. And it was a proviso and it was a new thing. Surprisingly, it was a new thing for this funding organisation at government level and revolutionary, right? They're all like, we've got this partnership thing, report on it and find out. Needless to say, it's actually ended up being a bit of a winner. And it's been a bit of a winner for some of the reasons that I've spoken about already in terms of expert knowledge in a field that needs expert knowledge. And I think the collaborations with these women's organisations, the Women's Health Organisation has been one of the big findings to report back, because they have the expertise and they have the access to knowledge and information around equity, gender equity training, and around gender-based violence in this particular one. What I will say is they have then the ability to build the capacity of the organisations in sport that they're working with, so the sports partners. So there was a lot of learning that happened in the organisations who were parts of the projects and project leads, let alone what was also happening then on the ground in sports and sports club. So that, I think there's a greater impact, or a greater measurable impact that can actually happen. But these take a long time to establish. So projects that are often funded for 1 year, that's a little really problematic. So you can't always develop that rapport and those relationships. So those relationships need space and time to be nurtured. And so one of the big things that we've learned is, like, we really have to tell both partners that this is hard. Sport is hard. This space is complex to work in for all the reasons that we know, and all the social reasons that are attached. So the challenges will exist, and it was really important that we acknowledge that in the funding, and also in the education and support that's provided to the projects over time, because they're going to continue to exist. Things like not enough funding to run projects, personnel changeover, clashes between philosophical ideas, and people not come to the party, and the resistance in sports clubs to these kinds of interventions and conversations. So I think one of the biggest takeaways that I've certainly learned from this partnership thing is that good support from the funding organisation has been really helpful. That's really encouraged people to stick together and work together, and providing them with communities of practice where they can share their lessons and their skills in a really safe, open environment, and learn from each other.
Great, thanks. Did you want to add, Laura?
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Karen. I think with some of my, more transformative work in mind, that it wouldn't have happened without the partnerships. So I think they're crucial if the aim is to advance social justice and equity. For a very long list of reasons, I think with partnership brings more diverse perspectives and experiences and lived experiences, which are more likely to lead to multi-pronged approaches. Linking to Karen's point, I think partnerships bring a greater chance of funding, greater likelihood of change, and I think the change tends to be more sustainable if you've worked with multiple partners and multiple sectors in particular over time.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess I want to turn back to some of your comments, Lisa Hunter, and sort of, again, that sort of longer-term view. It was interesting. I mean, it's great to hear that recognition of, new partners, I guess, providing an expert knowledge and being recognised as having that. But I wonder your reflections, Lisa Hunter, on sort of how you feel partnerships between educators, policymakers and, community have really progressed, or not, and feel free to say if it's or not, and what can be done to move us further forward.
Well, again, I'll reiterate, I think we have the answers already. It's just how has that been disseminated and who's listening. So student voice, it was big in the 80s, it was big again in the 2000s, and it's big again now. But is it being used? Victoria was a very strong advocate for student voice when I was researching classrooms, and but the middle schooling philosophy fell over essentially because we had these two bigger players in the room called primary, secondary education. I think the same's happening, and hence my comment about sport. Health has very good frameworks, even working now towards planetary health, but the socio-cultural approach that multi-level is important, and therefore partnerships are important. And it sort of depends to what is the game, what is the field, and who's in the room. We could look at other acronyms and talk about planetary health and say, well, what is the ocean? You know, totally change what's the question that we're asking. And at the same time understanding that it is all of these relationships that are vital to be multi-sectorial. The big Eat Well Be Active project that we evaluated many years ago was across government sectors, and in place-based areas it was also looking at how organisations within that place work together. Will anyone be surprised that those who had multi-level and good partnerships across were the most successful? No, they were more sustainable because you didn't need to have funding to keep the thing going, because those relationships, which take a long time to create, were the things that kept them going. You find money from somewhere else if you know that you're on a winning partnership in terms of making things happen. So, you know, we've seen great things come from grassroots work with teachers, working with outside organisations, with the parents, with the school, a whole of school approach, and they're the most successful. So I think we know what to do. Collective impact is a framework well known in health. We just got to do it.
So, yeah, so it's sort of interesting with those comments, you know, that recognition of we need that multi-levelness, we need cross-sectional, we need evidence that these have been and can be sustained over time. Can you pinpoint, you know, something or someone else about, you know, what therefore those key elements are that then we can replicate and we can scale up? Is better dissemination the, you know, key to this, or is it something else?
Well, I don't think we can say anything's key. It's many things that come together, and understanding that complexity, that I think the building of our language around frameworks like planetary health or intersectionality is enabling us to see we've always got to come back to see how things are interconnected. We separate them, we put them in silos. Partnerships sometimes bring those silos back, but how do we work in the complex environment to make things happen? When we identify what already works and why it works, I don't think that's the problem though. It's not what we know, it's about that knowledge-action gap and where all the resistance comes from on what seems like a good idea. We don't have to scratch the surface very hard to see where that resistance is. And some of it is pure apathy, some of it is ignorance, and that's where Vic Health did a lot of work around values changing and saw that the middle group is the group we've got to work with, I think you were talking about earlier. The top group already know what the changes are and enacting them. They need to be supported. But it's really hard to dismantle your own privilege. So to see it, first of all, is probably the big key that we try to work on in teacher education. And there is evidence that when students learn to see something, then they're more motivated to see the ways to undo how that privilege maintenance creates oppression and keeps it intact.
Great, thank you. And I want us now, we're sort of conscious of time, we're going to turn to sort of our last theme this evening, which is really those issues of how do we create sustainable change in health and physical education and sport, beyond short-term funded programs, you know, of work, beyond that sort of honeymoon period. How do we actually move things forward? So looking to the future, you know, what are the biggest opportunities and challenges that you see for sustainable social justice change, which I'd highlight, needs to be systemic. And so perhaps, one takeaway from everyone of what you think is critical to moving the needle from where we started this evening. So, Karen, you've got...
Okay.
I'm going to put the spotlight on you.
Okay, so you want my kind of like, how do we fix all this?
Absolutely.
Is that all?
1 point.
Look, it would be remiss of me not to draw on two things. Firstly, my own personal values and go, beep the system, and beep, swear word in there. Yeah, look, we can talk all day about the problems, right? So I think what I've learned from the project work that we've been doing is taking a whole of sport approach has been really useful. It really helps with the top down and the bottom up, and working with people. Intersectionality definitely has come through in this idea of partnerships. But I do think one key thing that that's happened that's a little bit different is that a funding round happened and then a funding round was extended. So we did previous research and our research impacted and over 1 year changed the program to 2 years, and then partway through the program they went, hey, this is doing some stuff, applied for some more funding, and now it's being extended to 3. And so that's really enabled some change to happen. And I think our research can impact, so evaluations that actually impact and change policy are really important.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I think a benefit of working in such a challenging context such as HPE when it comes to social justice and equity is that there is tons of opportunities for strengthening and further improvement. So I think that's the biggest opportunity. Another is there is no shortage of knowledge and expertise across the sport and education sectors that can be galvanised, should be galvanised, and are being galvanised in some cases for the purpose of social justice. I think in terms of challenges, Dawn, one is connecting these people, creating spaces for these partnerships to be developed and nurtured, and resourcing them so that they're sustainable and that they can support ongoing social justice work. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges, which I don't see going away anytime soon, is mainly people with fixed and archaic views about the world and how it should be. And they're probably one of the biggest barriers to change and advancing equity, I would say.
Great.
Okay. A couple of points. So we've talked about dismantling existing power structures early on. And I think if we look at clubs and sport, there hasn't been a lot of dismantling. We've just been talking about partnerships, club structures, funding, and in a sense I think they're important, but I think we're sort of missing the big picture from a sociological perspective. And Foucault was a scholar of social change, and he was interested in what underpinned that change, and often it wasn't planned organisation, it was sort of chance, accidents, etc. So I was involved in a project with Barbara Cox looking at the growth of women's soccer in New Zealand several years ago. And it started in the early 1970s, and what allowed it to start, these were women who had brothers, boyfriends, partners, husbands, dads who encouraged them into soccer. And they would start kicking a soccer ball around on the edge of the field next to men's games. And it was liberal feminism that encouraged them, and it was the activism of the second wave of feminism that underpinned that from the 60s. And initially when they played, they started to form teams, they started to have matches, and by the mid-70s, there were newspaper articles about them. They were trivialised and sexualised in the media. There were articles with headlines, kickers and knickers, and photos of the... but by the late 70s, their love of the game, they started to demand equity of resources within the clubs. And within the clubs with limited resources, this is when the female soccer players started to be known as dykes. This was the resistance against them to try and prevent them. So it was their activism at the local club level and the demanding of access to fields, changing rooms, coaches. Another 10 years passed and schools were promoting it as a good sport, and families were recognising and seeing the value of girls playing soccer. By the early 1990s, there was considerable growth in the game till we got to recently the Matildas match was the most viewed TV viewing experience in Australia of all time. But what underpinned it was the activism of the 60s, second wave of feminism. So my point is the need for people to stand up for injustices, and you never know where it might turn out.
Thank you. Lisa.
We know through enormous research that the less of inequality, the healthier a society is. So thinking about these slogans of we're all in this together, it is understanding that we're interconnected, and if somebody's getting more gain, somebody's getting less of a gain, and possibly not very much at all. So in terms of, if we think about health and how everything is connected, it is trying to reduce these differences, to understand what privilege and oppression works, how it works, and how we're part of that, and how sometimes it's only as simple as doing an acknowledgement of country, that some elders, when people started doing that, felt very recognised, and then that led to people listening a little bit more. So some of these changes are very, very small and probably get dismissed because of how small they are. But one of the biggest phrases I think we've got to dismantle is we treat everyone the same as an idea of equity, because we haven't even got to equality if we can't understand equity.
Thanks. And Ruth.
Thank you. I guess from my perspective, I think key for moving the needle in the sporting context that I work within is really a recognition that this sort of work in terms of equity, inclusion, however you kind of want to label it, but where we're looking at social justice work, it's not going to change within sport unless we embed that as part of our day-to-day practice and our everyday practice, and it's not something that's just a side-on and add-on, a focus on what we're doing. And I think that needs to be at all levels of the macro down to the micro system of sport as well. And I think interesting, going back to your point, Karen, in relation to funding, and funding is so central in sort of driving some of these agendas, but also we do have this kind of history of this type of work being programmatic because of the funding cycles and dependent on funding cycles and resources of what's available. And then there's also inequities and privilege and oppression in which groups access funding that we need to consider. And one project I'm working on at the moment, looking at anti-racism in sport, some of the sort of organisations I've been talking to about that have kind of said, well, actually, no, we're not doing that much in this space because there's no funding for it. There's not, we're focusing more on these other areas because that's where the funding streams are. So I think in terms of we kind of need to change anything significantly. We need to move away from thinking about social justice in relation to we prioritise or what we can get at this point of time in the moment, and really look more as to how is this part of just how our organisation works, be that at the club level, right the way through to the national sports governance sort of levels as well here. Thanks, Dawn.
Thank you. And I think really in sort of closing the discussion and as moving towards questions, I'd like to sort of thank you all, and I think you've conveyed perhaps not surprisingly, we're not dealing with simple issues, and there aren't sort of straightforward quick fix solutions that people are offering. These are in many ways not new issues either that we're sort of grappling with, but you've very much highlighted and brought to the fore the importance and the challenge of doing so, and of owning that challenge really, and I think, you know, everyone here and sort of online is probably, yeah, it is that challenge to reflect on how we're all personally a part of this, you know, and when we talk about that sort of decentering of privilege, we all have to acknowledge we're all somewhere in that, and our own language, you know, is part of either reproducing or changing things. So thank you all for sharing tremendous expertise and experience in your research, and hopefully we've got some questions and interest online. So I'll pass back to you, Ruth, to manage the questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dawn. And thanks so much, Dawn, for your expert facilitation and keeping us bang on time. So that's fabulous. Yeah, so we'd love to open up for questions to the audience. We've got some online. Also, those here with us in person, feel free to ask any questions. We can maybe start with some of the online questions. So, Lisa Hunter, do you want to take the first one maybe? How can educators and policymakers better support and make visible the empowerment in and as health and physical education?
I think if we did apply for some funding to do exactly this, find out what some of the good work that has been done and is still being done and how that can be disseminated. I know in the 90s, HPE did some work around teacher-researcher partnerships, and, you know, we've had multiple iterations of that as well. So it's noticing where the good work is and perhaps valuing it in many forms, whatever that form's needed, whether it is funding to increase it in scale or to keep it sustainable to a point where it can take on itself. I know the Women's Spirit Project at the moment is doing a lot of work just to get funding. It's already established that it's very effective, but it's getting the policymakers and in schooling instances, the educators to pay attention to where that good work is and continue to value it.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa Hunter. Open up to the audience here. Any questions from the floor? Okay, hand over to you.
Probably a voice from the ether for those online. This panel was dope, so interesting, and thanks to the organizers and to all the panelists and to Dawn for coming back home for a bit here. But building on some of the history Richard was talking about testing for women in sport, there's a great CBC NPR podcast called Tested that goes into that, the 100-year history of that. That's just phenomenal and quite something. But my panel, Karen and Ruth both talked about coaches, and Lisa Hunter mentioned recognizing privilege and kind of getting beyond it or dealing with it. It makes me think of coaches. So the question is, how do we sort of foster the evolution of coaches or the creation of coaches or leaders at clubs, in schools or clubs? I'm just thinking of Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate in the States. So this hetero, cis, older white guy from a conservative state that as a coach supported trans kids, queer kids, girls, and how can we kind of encourage more of that amongst HPE leaders or coaches, regardless of their own, multiple identities like Waltz, beyond that?
Thanks, Mark. Dawn, do you want to maybe join in the conversation here?
Great observation, Mark. I really appreciate the question. And I think I turn it to, I think, a point both Karen and Lisa Hunter made previously of who do we need to influence here, and I think it is that big sort of silent middle group that really I think there's a lot of potential there, and others will know from sort of some of my work previously, I've always said, no response is a response. And I think we've got a lot of that in the world of health and phys ed and sport, of people who, aren't stepping up to be those activists. But, whatever their multiple identities, can do that. And I think it's encouraging and empowering some of those people.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Dawn. Do we want to add, Laura?
Well, I was actually just going to ask a question as well. In terms of, in response to Mark's proposition, I'm thinking about the nature of at least community sports coaches and the fact that we rely heavily on volunteerism. My immediate response to your question, Mark, would be around coach education. But that obviously comes with a cost, and so that was really just like an observation, like where do you see coach education as something that can do some good work here, and are there affordances and challenges that come with that?
Full stop? Question?
Yeah,
I'll come in on that. Yeah, absolutely. I think coach education is fundamental. There's such a huge opportunity to really revamp coach education across all sports, I think, here, to really get into some of these issues of social justice and to challenge the current system. But currently, coach education doesn't really do that work, or if it does it in certain pockets, in certain sports. It's definitely not consistent across the board. So I think the coach ed space is a really powerful opportunity that's not currently being leveraged for all sorts of different reasons, really. So, yeah. Did you want to add anything, Lisa Hunter? Or?
I guess also looking at systems that value the coaches who are doing that work. There are lots of awards for a lot of things that say what's valued. Perhaps the same can be happening for coaches. And another key player in this partnership are educators.
Yep.
I think we devalue education too often. So when we say that sport is a possible space for education, sure is, but pay attention to educators and what they can bring to that partnership as well.
And I think I'd add to that we need to broaden our thinking about sport and about education, and therefore about who is playing what sort of coaching and education role, and recognise, if we're broadening notions of participation and thinking beyond clubs and beyond the structures that currently are the dominant ones for education, then how do we actually influence, the participation that is outside of those structures that is valued and that we probably should value more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Richard, there's a question for you that's come up that people are quite keen for you to answer. So in your examination of the trans-athlete debate, how do you propose sports organisations balance fairness and inclusivity while navigating the politically charged nature of this issue? Another quite straightforward, short question, I think. So,
did you hear me say it was a wicked problem? Mark, of interest with relation to your question, another political candidate in the States, Trump, was once very supportive of trans females, and he wanted them in his beauty competitions because he admired the IOC policy at one stage. Of course, he's changed his point of view now that he's a populist. With regards to balancing fairness and inclusivity, I would like to think that common sense prevails in a lot of sport, and people can work out the potential harms if someone is an ex-male footy player recently transitioned and 7 foot tall. Maybe there is a possibility of harm or risk, and some common sense could prevail. But I don't particularly care about elite level sport, and I guess, at the risk of being a little bit controversial, in a strange sense, when trans athletes want to compete at the Olympics, it can almost be a disservice to the broader issue of trans participation in sport, because it creates such a backlash, and I wouldn't want to advocate that they get banned, but I think it's an interesting point for discussion. But I think at the community sport level, with the woman that we interviewed for our rugby project, they were well aware that they might get hurt playing, but they valued rugby because of its culture of inclusiveness. And they said it doesn't matter if you're big, small, tiny, huge, black, white, lesbian, straight. The nice thing about rugby culture was it included people, and they were disappointed with World Rugby's stance. Through the banning of trans, and some of them said they'd played against trans player and that they weren't particularly skillful or big, and it wasn't a problem. And in their view, it was a non-issue. They were more concerned about women not getting good coaches and funding, and there are a whole range of other issues of concern. So hopefully some common sense can prevail within this wicked problem.
Can I debate that?
Go.
Just because we've all been turn-taking politely. I would like to disagree with the word common sense, because to me that's often popular sense, and common equals norm equals not listening to those who are missing out. So I think that we do have to look at what's the purpose of whatever game we're playing, whether it's sport or whether it's life or whether it's inclusion or education, but educating people to understand how oppression works and how privilege works, so that we can have a discussion about what we want as common sense, whether it's fairly ignorant senses of just what's been popular in the past by the dominant group, which also gets promulgated through our education system, or is it something that can unpack more complex problems like intersectionality, like wicked problems, to find solutions that have better outcomes for more people, if not all.
I think it's a good point, Lisa. Well done. My view of common sense isn't the common sense norm.
Just to open up to the floor here, are there any final questions we'd like to land on? Yeah. Hang on.
Thank you for the roundtable today. It's very knowledgeable and filled with insightful reflections. I'm a first-year PhD at Monash University. I'm Zhi Wei. And I want to ask, maybe all members can reply. And I want to ask, teaching is getting more demanding and daunting nowadays, and teacher has many balls to juggle with. So how do we fuel up student teachers' motivation to teach for social justice? Because there's so much individual burdens or volunteer works on it. And how do we keep them in the profession, especially in the area of high teacher shortage? If we are going to force to diversify our teacher workforce, how do we make sure teachers have capacities working towards social justice? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question and a big one, but I'll hand over maybe to this side of the panel.
Karen's burning to have a go.
Yeah, it's my PhD student, so I feel like we should at least have a go at it. Choe, thank you. That's a really complex question. It's at the centre of it is teacher burnout, and the same teachers picking up the scraps of having to support student wellbeing and that kid that doesn't fit into the room, how I've got it structured, or the learning program, and differentiation, universal design, whatever you want to call it, whatever the student is, teachers who care often carry the burden of social justice, and I think that's kind of the crux of it. And then how do we retain these kinds of people who actually have their heart in the game? And I think it's a fantastic question, because I know personally, one of the reasons that I actually left the education system in schools was because I felt that burden of doing those things, and it was hard work. but the reason that it works for me in university is because I can be more creative about that. I can actually disrupt systems and start to think about problems in different kinds of ways and start to theorise about them in different kinds of ways. And I don't think teachers in schools and school contexts firstly get that kind of training and thoughtfulness in their undergraduate degrees, and certainly they are not encouraged in school contexts to operate in those ways, but they are expected to look after kids and to pick up these roles. So I think greater support and structures around schooling, I think a whole restructure of schooling is in order that can be supportive of the sorts of people who actually do care to stay in the system and to value their contributions in ways that are affirming and positive and optimistic, that keep them there doing good work, as good teaching as well as good caring and good sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen. Right, I'm aware of the time now, so I'll wrap things up there. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's come to join us in person. Thanks to our colleagues and our friends from other organisations that have come in and been with us today. Thank you everyone online for joining us. We really appreciate your engagement and your participation in the event. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Lisa Hunter, to Richard, Dawn, thank you for coming over and making the trip over from the West to be here. Thanks to Laura and thank you to Karen. And also a huge thank you to Chandra and the team, the events team, the tech team at the back over here for all your sort of amazing facilitation of the event tonight. It's been fantastic. Just to finish off as well, I just wanted to mention some upcoming events that we've got. So we're actually coming back again for an event next Wednesday, hosted by the School of Curriculum Teaching and Inclusive Education. And this time we're doing a deep dive into the learning design and technology space and really looking at how we can use learning design to transform education experiences. We've also got a fantastic leadership masterclass course coming up, building, I guess, on a lot of the things we've talked about today in terms of what does radical leadership look like and leadership for social justice. So please go on the QR code there and you'll get more details of those events.